Welcome to 5 Dubs by MDDC Press. I'm your host, Rebecca Snyder, the Executive Director of the Maryland, Delaware, and D.C. Press Association, which represents news media in our region. 5 Dubs focuses on the who, what, when, where, and why of local news media. We'll talk with the journalists about the stories behind the news. You can find more information about our guests in the show notes or on our website, www.5-dubs.com. Welcome, everyone. I am delighted to have emissaries from the APG media stable of papers with us today. I've got Jim Johnson, the executive editor, and Chad Campbell, who's the assistant general manager for operations. So welcome to the program, both of you.
Thank you, Rebecca.
So glad to have you. And so it's kind of awkward in some ways to say, oh, this is APG media, because APG is made up of over a dozen hyper local publications. So can you start off by telling us a little bit about who is in your family and the areas that you cover? Jim, do you want to start? You're probably covering them directly.
Sure. We have a dozen newspapers throughout Maryland, from Dorchester County on the southern part of the Eastern Shore, all the way up to Cecil County, right just south of the Pennsylvania border, right outside of Baltimore. We have the Dundalk Eagle and the Essex, the Avenue. And in southern Maryland, we have the Southern Maryland News, which covers Calvert, Charles, and St. Mary's counties. In addition to that,
Go ahead, tell me more. I'm sorry to cut you off.
In addition, we have DC military publications, a number of publications geared to military bases in the area, and a magazine, At Ease. We have 2 other magazines, the Wedding magazine that we produce twice a year, and Shore magazine that is produced 6 times a year.
That is a huge number of publications for what I always consider sort of a scrappy, smallish staff. So I am super impressed by that. And I'm also, you guys had told me before we started that you have some significant anniversaries coming up. So Chad, do you want to tell us the exciting anniversaries of some of those publications?
Yeah, we're celebrating 3 this year, and we just celebrated the 150th in Southern Maryland, one of the 3 publications that was merged into the Southern Maryland News 2 years ago. And this, in the next couple months, we'll be celebrating the Star Democrat will celebrate their 225th anniversary, and the Bay Times Record Observer, I believe, next month celebrates, and Jim will correct me if I'm wrong here, too. It's 200.
That is correct. We will be out at the Queen Anne's County Fair to celebrate that Record Observer's anniversary.
So those are really big numbers, 150, 225, 200. What's the secret to that kind of longevity? I know that your publications are really core pieces of the community, but what's the secret to staying around for that long?
I'll let Jim jump in just a second, but I think you mentioned the term hyperlocal, and one of those anniversaries did take place already back in July. It was in Southern Maryland, and it was really inspiring to see local officials, mayors, state senator came with a proclamation to just talk about, how important it is to have a local outlet for the types of news that's not going to be served by the metro newspaper, and the connectivity that makes with the community. It was heartwarming to see all the people who came and celebrated with us, not to mention a letter from the President of the United States, and we were really glad to get that. We featured it on our anniversary edition, and as I shared with the people here, there's a lot of people who do really good work, and really good vocations. Not every one of them gets a letter from the president returning.
That's so cool. That's great. And so, Jim, you're in the midst or in the mix of covering all those communities as executive editor. So you supervise all of those publications editorially. Tell us more about sort of that focus on local news and what that means to you and for the coverage.
Well, we always talk about hyperlocal news. If it happens in our communities, we want to cover it. Recently, we've made a move, all of our newspapers, to drop AP, both state and national coverage out of our papers. We have a national e-edition that we run every day online. But I think more than anything else, our circulation numbers, if you look at just circulation numbers, that's only one part of the puzzle for us. We have both the print products that we still put out, but we also have online, and our newspapers work to be daily newspapers where we're producing stories as they happen online. We have e-editions for all of our newspapers. And then we also have other events, as I mentioned earlier, Shore Magazine and the Weddings Magazine. And coupled with that, we have a lot of events. Just this week, I was out in Denton, Maryland, where we had our summer speaker series. And that's tied to another publication we do called Women to Watch, where we highlight women throughout the Eastern Shore and Southern Maryland. Each one of our publications has a Women to Watch element to it. We seek nominations from the community for the Women to Watch. And then the ones that are picked, there's a group of judges that pick them, and we highlight them in the magazine. But then we also have the events where the speakers get up and they talk. The topic in Denton this past week was passion and presence for these women. And there was a group of 5 women in each that talked on that topic.
Actually, I remember this because you all won the MDDC's Best Moves Award for 2023 for that Women to Watch summer series. So and I remember talking to Christy English about how she put that together and how that kind of has been a real way to not only attract readers to your publications and to your news and your websites, but also to knit the community together, to connect people that wouldn't necessarily have met in other ways. And so that idea of community news as that sort of town square, I feel like in a lot of your publications and coverage areas, that's kind of what you're doing with the events that you have and the coverage and the special sections. Am I getting that right? Is that part of the philosophy, or is that just sort of a happy happenstance?
That's very much part of our philosophy, is connecting communities and building communities. I think we don't just cover the news, but we are part of the community and have been for, in some cases, up to 225 years. So that's a big part. When you look at our numbers and all the different things we do, we reach more people today than we probably ever have, with not just our print products, but our online, the apps that we have, our events, our magazines. So that's part of building and maintaining community throughout the state of Maryland.
Yeah. And so when you are, did that kind of organically come about, all of those pieces, or did you sort of just see the opportunity? Because geographically, some of your communities are they're not they're destination communities. So how did you kind of evolve that strategy of events, pubs, apps, and news? Was that something that just organically happened?
I think to some extent it's organic, but there's also, you mentioned the term geographic community, and some of the communities that we serve aren't something that you would find on Google Maps.
Yeah.
You mentioned our DC military. The military and Department of Defense employees are a community. Women engaged in entrepreneurial endeavors and in ranking positions in local firms, they are a community, whether they live in the same town. So a lot of the benefit that we see is mentioned from the events is not just the event itself, but the conversation that brings and the engagement that builds with our publications, not just the Women to Watch edition, but the publications that follow.
Oh, and so I want to talk about the challenges of covering such a wide geographic area. I mean, I always think visually of you guys, up in Elkton, coming all the way down through the shore, curving around back under, and then serving Essex and Dundalk and areas like that. That's a huge territory. Before we started to record, Jim was joking that he chose that Cambridge was probably the farthest place he could have chosen to have to travel to every publication in your group. What are some of the challenges? How do you keep that hyperlocal perspective, juggling so many different places and such a wide geographic spread?
We have people in each of the communities, and that is so important for us. Is we don't cover and too many newspaper groups these days try to cover communities from afar. You just can't do that. You have to be there, boots on the ground, editors and reporters in each of those communities, covering those. And I think having people at council meetings, having people at school board meetings, having people attending community events, that is so important to maintaining that connection with communities.
No, it is. And I'm sorry, Chad, go ahead.
Well, I would just, and we also, reach out to leaders in the communities. The Star Democrat this year created a reader advisory that Jim has been leading that for us, but we ask those folks to come in every 2 or 3 months, and we talk about not only what they've seen in the papers for the past few months, but also what we're planning to do going forward. So we get that input from community leaders, advertisers, religious leaders, civic leaders. And besides, just one of the things that's impressed me the most about that group is just how engaged and involved they really do feel that the Star Democrat in this case is their newspaper, our newspaper. It's not them advising from afar. They are actively engaged in planning and thinking how the Star Democrat can better represent.
Well, and I think, yes, reflecting the community that you serve, and it is wonderful that group, the Reader Advisory Board, is so invested that they treat it as our newspaper, as opposed to, okay, we'll arm's length sort of judge that paper, that they really see it as part of the fabric. Now, both of you have worked in a lot of other situations. So tell me how, in terms of, as the assistant general manager and the executive editor, you have a lot of wherewithal. You have a lot of sway in what happens in this local group. So tell me a little bit more about how your past experiences have informed what you're trying to build here. And Jim, why don't you start? Because editorially, I think it's I want to see what kind of through lines you're building.
Well, I've been working in newspapers for a long time now, and I've worked for small community newspapers and large regional newspapers. But the thing that ties all of them together is connecting with communities. being part of
Mm.
communities and covering those communities. I worked for many years in Omaha, Nebraska, the Omaha World Herald. We were a statewide newspaper there, and Omaha, for those who remember their geography, is on the far eastern edge of Nebraska, and we covered all the way out to Scottsbluff, Nebraska, which was 8 hours away. We actually had to start
Wow.
classes at 7 p.m. to truck those newspapers those 8 hours out to Scottsbluff every day. But that was part of what we did, was we were Nebraska's newspaper. And I think that's important for any newspaper. What I work with our editors here is being whatever community we are, being that community's newspaper and covering that community. So I think that is for successful newspapers, that's what makes them successful, is defining their communities and then covering those communities.
Mm. Can you tell me about a time where you feel like you were really successful in sort of being the heart of that community?
Well, here in Easton, we had a mayoral election last year. It was just like politics anywhere these days. It seemed to be a lot more vicious than previous elections had been. And I think what we did was we covered that and provided information to readers on the candidates, on all of the candidates, and provided in an unbiased fashion on our news pages, which allowed our readers and the people in the communities to make good choices on when they went to the ballot box. And I think that's a really important part of what newspapers do, is provide information to the community so readers and residents can be part of that community.
Right. Well, and I feel like we've all been in the the voting line and realizing, oh my gosh, I don't know. It's sometimes really hard to find unbiased, objective information about candidates. You can go to their websites. Sometimes they're better websites than others, but a voter guide kind of levels the playing field because everyone's answering the same questions and providing information that then the outlet can say, okay, here's what it is. I do think that's a really important service, and there's not as many people covering the local angle on that. I was talking to Jerry Zemskry, from the local news network. I always butcher his name, from the University of Maryland, and I know that you all have done some collaborative projects where you've run, say, their school board voters guide, or working with some. I think their latest project was the child care analysis across the state. So, can you tell me a little bit about how you're able to capitalize on your geographic reach to cover issues that, in some ways, if you're just a small local group, that maybe the Star Democrat couldn't tackle, but once you have the Star Democrat and the Cecil Whig and the Dundalk Eagle and all of the publications working together, and maybe even teaming with an outside source, you can do a little bit more. Have you been able to do some of those enterprise projects?
Yeah, I will tell you that the strength of APG Chesapeake came through when the Francis Scott Key Bridge collapsed. We have the other end of the bridge, Dundalk. We have a newspaper there. It's a one-person newspaper. We have an editor reporter who covers that community. Well, when something like this happens, one person cannot cover that story by themselves. We brought in an editor. We shifted another editor from Essex down to help coverage, and we shifted a reporter from Easton up to Dundalk to provide that first day coverage. We also did something, and not all editors would agree with this was a good decision, but we decided early on, this is a national story. There's going to be a lot of national coverage of this. You know, the Washington Post had multiple people, New York Times, multiple people. So before 7 a.m. that morning, I'd called the Baltimore Banner and asked them to help us with our coverage, that they would do the big story, what happened and how it happened and all the national voices that were in there. We have an 80-person newsroom. We can't compete with that, so we partnered with them on that. And then our reporters, we had 3 reporters on the ground that day, covered the local angle. They went and talked to people in the community and talked about the remembrances of the bridge. Vado, who was one of the candidates for Rookie of the Year in MDDC, went up and stood on a hilltop overlooking the bridge and was just packed with people. And she talked with people who had just crossed that bridge hours before it had collapsed. And
Right.
that partnership allowed us to not focus on the press conferences and all that were going on that day, but to focus on the local impact. The thing that we can do better than anybody else is connect with our community. And that's what our reporters were able to do.
That's a terrific way to go about it. And it sort of capitalizes on everybody's strengths. So even though audiences keep going up because of the power of the internet and just more people in the mix as well, newsrooms don't have always the capacities that they used to have. And so figuring out sort of where your lane is, what you do best, and then partnering with others, I think is a really important aspect to work through. And so APG Chesapeake is part of a larger APG media. I don't know if it's an empire yet, but it's getting there. So, Chad, can you talk about sort of how all those pieces play together?
Yeah. So we kind of touched on it, but I think, I've had an opportunity to work for other larger firms, some family firms, and APG kind of brings the best of both worlds and still has that commitment to local coverage, actual people in the communities that they're serving. But we also get the benefit of expertise and some vertical alignments within the larger company. So Jim did an excellent job detailing how we internally at APG Chesapeake can rotate resources around in a pinch to cover something like Francis Scott Key Bridge. We also benefit from national coverage of things, the Olympics, which Adams is publishing group page on our websites and as well. So we get a little bit of the best of both worlds. There have been pieces like about a year ago about inflation. One of the neat things, that was a well-followed story that contributed to by reporters in both our areas in Wisconsin and Minnesota. With track for the year, every time the story would run, it would show what's the price of eggs going for in our markets in Wisconsin versus Chesapeake. Things that were interesting to people to watch as those both went up and down, of course. So it's wonderful to be able to both benefit from a larger chain, but still have that local, the commitment from the top down to that local.
I do feel like it's the local piece that often kind of gets lost in the sauce as companies can kind of retrench and consolidate into 1 or 2 offices. I think it is impressive that you have, people on the ground in every place you're looking at, because, it's hard to cover a school board meeting or a council meeting only by Zoom. Many times those places are, those meetings are live streamed, but then you miss all the back and forth, the who's walking up with who and what's happening. So I think that having the model that you guys have worked on has been really effective. So what's next for APG Chesapeake? And actually, I guess before we get into sort of like what's next, I wanted to ask about the military papers because that's very unusual. I think out of all the MDDC membership, you all have the most military papers and kind of treat them as their own divisions. So tell me how that works and if that kind of integrated into your newsroom or how you approach that particular community.
Sure. So, Eli Wollenhaus, who is an editor, reports to Jim, leads our division from the editorial stand. And it kind of takes two different tracks. One is that a lot of times bases want to produce their own, just a guide to a new member from the community, a visitor, someone new living on the base, can have everything from phone number. And we will print and produce based on the content that those public affairs officers provide us. And then we will help them do it at no cost because we will sell the advertising. Kind of a win-win to get the information in the base guide that they use an evergreen for the entire year. And we get defray the printing costs with the. Then, as Jim referred to, we have actual publications that are local content produced locally by Eli and his team, like the At Ease publication, which focuses not only military-based life, but can be things like just what do you do for enjoyment and entertainment. They have that publication had, I believe it was last month, their publication focused golf courses and service members and contractors that they might be. So it's a mix of both those things that the bases provide us and that we print, sell advertisement into, and other content that provides advertisers, which really love the ability to message directly to the members of those bases.
That's an incredibly tight target market. I mean, like that, you know exactly what you're getting there. So from an advertising perspective, that must be a really interesting space. And also, the issues on that community, because of where your publications are located, they sort of are integrated or they're close to some of the places where you already have newspapers. So that's sort of an interesting perspective and mix there for sure. So what is next for APG? What are you, aside from all of the festivities around your celebrations and congratulations on your big anniversaries, what's next?
Chad, I'll let you take that.
Okay. A lot of it's going to be continued down the path that we have in both, as we all know, everyone probably listening to this works at a place that is transitioning from, to some regard in both digital content and advertising. So we will continue to train and implement that, but we're also looking to be as responsive as we can to market needs and making sure that we provide some flexibility both to our readers, but also to our advertisers. An example of that is this weekend, our Sunday Star, the Sunday publication, will move to Saturday delivery, in large part because we have seen and anticipate issues with continuing to deliver carriers over. And so moving that into Saturday delivery will get us to the point where those subscribers we must deliver by mail or some future will get same day delivery as opposed to receiving their Sunday paper. Seems like a small thing, but it's not when you talk about, communication with readers and advertisers and everything from system builds. But just the kind of thing that we're on the lookout for to try to anticipate where the
Well, and it's hard to make plans for 5 years now. I feel like 3 is probably 3, 4, 5 years are really all you can kind of peer into your crystal ball. And so it sounds like initiatives like your reader advisory board are really helping you navigate some of those potentially complex issues. And I do feel like the news media industry doesn't have a lot of room for missteps. The margins are very, very thin. The mission is incredibly critical. And there just is not a lot of room for error. So I'm glad to see that you're kind of taking that step back into the community and using entities like a reader advisory board to kind of make sure that, you're not operating in a vacuum. That makes a lot of sense to me.
Jim, can you touch on our podcast? That's a great segue into that.
Sure. We started just this summer, and we're up to about 14 or 15. We're doing weekly podcasts at our three largest newspapers, the Star Democrat in Easton, the Southern Maryland News, and the Cecil Whig. And one of the things anyone who's done podcasts will tell you that they are hard to do. They're very time consuming, takes a long time creating the content and then editing it to into a coherent podcast. Eli Wallenhouse, that Chad mentioned, that does our DC publications, also does our digital publications also. And Eli found a software package that takes the written word and converts it into podcast for us using AI generated voices. So, and we use this. Our editors, it takes them about 40 minutes. They pull together 6 to 10 stories of the highlights of the week, and then feed it into this. And then the voices it's a podcast voice. Sounds very realistic. We do have a disclaimer at the end saying that this was created using AI generated voices, but it's still editors who are deciding the content and putting that up. These are available not just on our websites, but also on Spotify and Apple. Oh, and
so what's the name of the? Oh, great. So that's it sounds like News Roundup podcasts in 3 of your major markets. What's the name of those podcasts?
The name is Listen Up. So it's Listen Up Star Democrat, Listen Up Southern Maryland News, and Listen Up Cecil Whig. And if you go on to Spotify or Apple and type in Listen Up and the name of the newspaper, you can subscribe to it.
That sounds terrific. Have you started to get more traction on that yet, or is it still early days?
It's growing. When we first started, it was a soft launch, and we launched just on our websites, and we didn't have very good numbers to start with that. But then when we moved to Spotify, the numbers started shooting up right away.
Great. Well, that sounds like a amazing way to kind of repurpose content and reach new audiences. And that's really when you're dealing with local content, you want to make sure that everyone who's affected by the news has access to it. And sounds like that's a wonderful step, and utilizing sort of very directed resources like reader advisory boards and having reporters and editors embedded in those communities will mean that you are around to celebrate a lot more milestone anniversaries. So thank you both for coming to be with me today. Is there any last words that you'd like to say about APG?
No, other than to thank you for your time, Rebecca, and MDDC for all it does.
Oh, well, thank you. It is always great talking to both of you, and I will see you next time. Can't wait to hear what your next big move is for next year and how those podcasts and advisory boards are going. So thank you all for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to 5 Dubs with Rebecca Snyder. Please subscribe and leave us a 5-star review wherever you download your podcasts so that others can find us. What do you want to know about local journalism? Email me at rsnyder, SNYDER, at mddcpress.com. Interested in supporting our podcast and journalism? Please donate to our 501c3 Press Foundation. Find out more and see the full episode list and show notes at www.5-dubs.com.